Emily was sitting in the back seat of the car holding her small, blue backpack against her chest while her father drove through the falling snow on the long road to her grandmother. How's the air was cold and the windows were fogged, and she could see the trees covered in snow like silent watchers in the night. The sky was dark, and the only light came from the headlights, cutting through the heavy snowflakes falling like whispers from the sky. She did not want to go to the cabin, but her father said it was important to spend Christmas with family, even if it was in the middle of nowhere, even if the roads were empty, and the snow was getting thicker with every mile. Her grandmother was waiting outside the small wooden cabin, wrapped in a red shawl that moved in the wind like a flag. Her eyes were tired, and her smile was small as she waved at them. While the snow covered her boots, Emily stepped out and felt the snow on her hair and the cold air on her face as she looked at the cabin that stood like a shadow in the middle of the forest. Her father hugged her and told her to be brave and to listen to everything. Her grandmother says because old houses have old rules, and Christmas has its own stories, and some stories are not. For telling her father left after dinner, leaving Emily alone with her grandmother, who locked the doors and placed a small silver bell on the windowsill. The cabin smelled of old wood and burning fire, and the only sound was the crackling from the fireplace as the snowstorm outside grew louder in the night. Her grandmother gave her a warm blanket and told her to stay close to the fire if she heard the scratching under the floor. She told her not to open the basement door, no matter how many times she heard the knocking, and if she heard the bell ringing, she must hide under the table and cover her ears. Emily tried to sleep, but the wind outside was screaming like voices lost in the cold, and the shadows in the room moved with the flames, making shapes on the walls that looked like long hands reaching for her. She closed her eyes and tried to think of warm lights and her father's smile, but the scratching started under the floor, slow and soft like something was crawling just under the wood. She pulled the blanket over her head, but the scratching grew louder, moving from one end of the room to the other, like it was looking for something. The bell on the windowsill rang once, clear and sharp in the room, and Emily felt her heart stop as she remembered her grandmother's words. She climbed under the wooden table and covered her ears, but she could still hear the scratching. The knocking on the basement door, soft at first, then louder with each knock. She wanted to scream for her grandmother, but the house was silent, and the only sound was the bell ringing again and again. The door of the basement opened with a long creak, and cold air rushed into the room, making the fire flicker and the shadows grow longer. She peeked from under the table and saw a pale hand with long fingers curling around the edge of the basement door. The hand was thin like sticks, and the skin was white like snow. As it pulled itself out from the darkness, the rest of the figure crawled out, slow and twisted, with a head that turned too far and eyes that were black like the night outside. It was wearing a small red hat with a white ball at the end, and it dragged itself across the floor, leaving wet marks on the wood. The bell rang again, and the thing stopped and turned its head toward the sound. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out, only a soft breath that made the bell ring. Again it crawled closer to the windowsill, reaching for the bell with its long fingers, while the snow outside hit the windows in waves. Emily held her breath under the table as the thing turned its black eyes toward her and tilted its head. The bell rang again, and the thing snapped its head back toward the window as a gust of wind blew the bell off the sill and onto the floor. The thing let out a soft sound like a laugh with no air and moved toward the bell, picking it up with careful fingers. It placed the bell on its tongue and swallowed it. Its black eyes turned back to Emily under the table, and it started to crawl toward her, slow and silent, the wet marks on the floor leading to where she was hiding. She closed her eyes and prayed for the morning to come. The thing stopped in front of her and reached out its hand. Cold air wrapped around her fingers as it touched her hand, and she felt the bell inside its chest ringing slow and soft in the silence. It leaned close, and she felt its breath on her face, cold and heavy, as it whispered her name in a voice that sounded like the wind. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the red hat falling from its head onto the floor as the shadows swallowed the light from the fire, and the snow outside fell in silence, waiting for the dawn Marcus was driving through. The thick falling snow with Noah asleep in the back seat, holding his small green blanket while the radio played soft Christmas music that was breaking with static as the road turned darker and the trees closed in around them like tall shadows. In the night the headlights showed the road ahead, but the snow was too heavy, and Marcus could feel the tires slipping on the cold, wet road as he tried to keep the car straight. Noah opened his eyes and asked if they were almost home, but Marcus did not want to lie, so he told him they needed to find a place to stop until the snow passed. Noah looked out of the window at the dark forest and held his blanket tighter. Marcus saw a small road leading into the trees, and he turned the car hoping to find shelter. As the snowstorm grew stronger, they found an old church standing alone in the middle of the forest. Its tall wooden cross broken and hanging to the side and the windows dark and covered in ice. Marcus parked the car and told Noah to stay close. As they stepped into the cold air that burned their skin, they ran to the church and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The inside smelled of old wood and wet earth, and the air was cold and heavy. They found old wooden pews covered in dust and a single candle sitting on the altar. Marcus lit the candle, and the small light pushed back the shadows just enough for them to see the inside of the church. Noah asked if they could sing a Christmas song to feel less scared, and Marcus nodded. As they sat on the cold wooden floor, Noah started to hum Silent Night, and his small voice echoed in the empty church. Marcus felt tears in his eyes, but he wiped them away as he joined Noah in the song. The wind outside howled, and the snow hit the windows, but inside the small light of the candle made them feel safe for a moment until they heard in a soft humming coming from the dark corner of the church. It was the same song they were singing, but the voice was cold and broken, like someone was singing with a mouthful of ice. Marcus stood up and told Noah to stay behind him. As he walked toward the sound, the candle flickered, and the shadows moved on the walls like long, thin fingers reaching for them. The humming stopped, and the silence was heavy. Noah asked who was there, but there was no answer. Marcus felt the cold air move around him as he stepped closer to the dark corner, and he saw a small figure standing in the shadows, wearing an old red coat and a hat pulled low over its face. Its hands were small and white, and it was holding a small bell that was ringing without moving. The figure lifted its head, and Marcus saw the pale face of a child with eyes that were black like the night and a mouth that was open, but there was no sound, only the soft ringing of the bell. Marcus stepped back and told Noah to run, but the door of the church slammed shut with the wind, and the candle went out, leaving them in the dark. The soft humming started again, but now it was coming from all around them, like the walls were singing the same broken song. Marcus grabbed Noah and tried to open the door, but it would not move. Noah started to cry, and the humming grew louder. The small figure stepped out of the shadows, and more figures followed, all small, all wearing red coats and hats, all holding small bells that rang softly in the dark. Their black eyes watching Marcus and Noah as they moved closer. The figure started to hum louder, and the sound was like ice in Marcus' ears. He covered Noah with his arms as the figures reached out, their small cold hands touching his back and arms. Marcus felt the cold sink into his skin and the bells ringing in his head as the humming grew louder and louder. Noah was screaming, but the sound was lost in the ringing and the humming. Marcus looked up and saw the figures lifting their heads, their mouths open wide as the humming turned into a scream that was silent, but he could feel it in his bones. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the small pale face of the first figure looking at him with its black eyes and the bell in its hand ringing one last time. Before everything went quiet and the dark took everything, Sarah was sitting in the passenger seat while Daniel drove through the quiet, snowy road leading to the rented cabin where they planned to spend Christmas away from the noise of the city. The world outside was covered in white, and the trees stood like tall shadows with the moonlight touching the snow, making it look like cold fire. Daniel smiled at Sarah, telling her it would be a peaceful Christmas, just the two of them and the snow and the fire. Sarah smiled back, but inside her chest there was a small feeling that something was wrong. When they reached the cabin, it stood alone in the forest. With a small porch covered in snow and the windows dark like eyes watching them, Daniel unlocked the door, and they stepped inside. The air was cold and smelled of old wood, and the wind outside made the walls creak like something was moving in the dark. Sarah found an old Santa costume in the attic, wrapped in plastic with a note pinned to it saying wear it to keep them away. She laughed and showed it to Daniel, who shrugged and said maybe it was a joke from the owner of the cabin. But when the wind outside grew stronger and the branches of the trees scratched against the windows like fingers, Sarah could not stop thinking about the note. They made a fire in the fireplace and sat close to it while the wind howled outside and the snow kept falling. Sarah felt warm for a moment with the glow of the fire and the sound of Daniel talking about how they would cook a small Christmas dinner. But then she saw it through the window, a figure standing between the trees wearing a Santa costume with a red hat and white fur, but the face was dark and hidden in the shadow. The figure was not moving, and the snow fell around it like cold ash. Sarah told Daniel, but when he looked, the figure was gone. The night grew colder, and the fire burned lower, and Sarah could hear the wind whispering around the cabin, like voices calling her name. They decided to go to bed, and Daniel held her close, telling her everything was fine, but Sarah could not sleep. She heard footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy like boots stepping on old wood. She held her breath and listened as the footsteps moved around the cabin, stopping. At the window, she saw the shadow of the Santa figure standing outside the window, with the snow falling around it. She could not see its face, but she could feel it watching her. The footsteps moved again, and the door handle moved like someone was trying to open it. Daniel woke up and grabbed the small flashlight, telling Sarah to stay inside while he checked the noise. She tried to stop him, but he opened the door and stepped into the cold, dark night. The wind blew into the room, making the candle flicker, and Sarah felt the cold wrap around her like a hand. She waited and waited. Daniel did not come back. She heard the footsteps again, but this time they were inside the cabin, moving slow on the wooden floor. Sarah hid under the bed, holding her breath as the footsteps moved closer. She saw the boots. First old black boots covered in snow, and then the red pants with white fur at the bottom. The Santa figure stood in the middle of the room, holding a large black sack that dragged down the floor, making a soft scratching sound. Sarah could hear the sound of something moving inside the sack, like something was trying to get out. The figure dropped the sack on the floor, and it moved again, shaking and twisting like something alive. The figure turned its head slowly, and Sarah saw the face for a moment, pale and cold, with dark, empty eyes and a mouth that was too wide, with a smile that looked like it was cut into the skin. The figure bent down and opened the sack, and Sarah saw a hand reach out from inside. It was Daniel's hand, pale and shaking as it reached for help, but the figure grabbed the hand and pushed it back inside the sack. Sarah wanted to scream, but she covered her mouth with her hand as tears fell from her eyes. The figure tied the sack closed and lifted it over its shoulder, turning toward the door. It stopped and turned its head back toward Sarah under the bed, the dark eyes looking at her, and the mouth smiling wider as it lifted a finger to its lips. As if telling her to stay silent, it stepped out of the cabin into the cold, snowy night, leaving the door open, and the wind blew inside, making the candle go out and leaving Sarah in the cold, dark silence with the sound of the wind and the soft falling snow waiting for the dawn. Kevin was standing in the empty mall on Christmas Eve, wearing his security uniform, while the lights above flickered with a soft buzzing sound that echoed in the cold, empty air. The stores were closed, and the decorations hung from the ceiling with bright colors and fake snow, but in the silence of the night, they looked like frozen ghosts. Kevin walked through the mall with his flashlight, moving over the glass windows of the dark stores where mannequins stood dressed in Christmas clothes with frozen smiles on their pale faces. He checked his watch, waiting for the end of his shift as the snow outside fell heavier, covering the parking lot in white silence. The wind howled against the glass doors, and Kevin felt the cold moving through the cracks like a breath on his neck. He heard a soft sound like a bell ringing, and he turned his head, but saw nothing, just the empty hallways of the mall with the lights flickering. He moved toward the sound, his boots echoing on the floor, and the bell rang again. This time closer, he stopped in front of a store that sold Christmas decorations and toys. The window was dark, but he saw movement inside, something small and quick. Kevin unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled like plastic and old dust, and the shelves were filled with toys and lights and small Santa figures. He moved the flashlight over the shelves and stopped. When he saw a small elf mannequin standing on the floor that was not there. Before, it was wearing a green outfit with a red hat, and its face was painted with a smile, but the eyes were black and empty. The bell rang again, and the mannequin fell over with a soft thud on the floor. Kevin felt a cold shiver run through him as he picked it up and placed it back on the shelf, but when he turned around he saw another elf mannequin standing in the middle of the aisle, closer than before. The lights above flickered, and the bell rang again. Kevin stepped back toward the door, but the door closed by itself with a soft click, trapping him inside. The mannequins were moving closer, their small painted faces smiling in the flickering light. Kevin tried to open the door, but it would not move, and he heard the bell again. Right behind him, he turned and saw the elf mannequins standing close now, their black eyes looking at him with cold, empty stares. He backed away into the aisle, knocking over toys and decorations. As he moved, the mannequins followed without moving, their legs appearing closer each time he blinked. He ran toward the back of the store and found a small storage room locking the door behind him. He turned off his flashlight and sat in the dark, listening to his own breathing. The bell rang again outside the door, followed by the sound of small feet moving on the floor. He covered his mouth with his hand, trying not to make a sound. The light from the bottom of the door showed small shadows moving back and forth. The bell rang again, and the shadows stopped. Kevin closed his eyes and prayed for the morning, but the bell rang louder, now right outside the door, and the handle moved slowly. The door opened with a slow creak, and Kevin saw the small elf mannequin standing in the doorway, holding small bells that rang softly in the silence. Their faces were smiling, but their eyes were empty and cold. They stepped into the room without moving, their legs appearing closer each time he blinked, until they stood in front of him, the bells ringing softly. Kevin could not move as the mannequins lifted their small hands, reaching for him, the bells ringing louder now in his ears. As the cold filled the room, the lights outside flickered and went out, leaving the room in darkness with only the sound of the bells ringing in the silence. As the mannequins closed in around him, their cold hands touching his arms, and the bells ringing until there was nothing but the dark. Emily woke up in the snow outside the old cabin, with the cold air burning her skin and the world around her silent under the heavy white sky. She looked around and saw the forest standing like dark shadows, with the trees covered in ice and snow falling slow and soft. She tried to remember how she got there. All she could see in her mind was the pale hand reaching from the floor, and the sound of the bell ringing inside the dark. She stood up and saw a small silver bell lying in the snow, ringing softly with the wind. She picked it up and felt a cold shiver run through her body as the bell stopped ringing, and the world around her grew quieter than before. Marcus opened his eyes in the snow near the edge of the forest, with Noah lying beside him, holding his small green blanket and looking up at the sky with tears on his cold face. Marcus hugged him close and told him it was over, but the sound of the bell in the distance made him stop. He looked down and saw a small silver bell in the snow, ringing softly with each gust of wind. Noah touched the bell and the ringing stopped, but the cold around them grew deeper. Sarah was walking through the snow, holding the small red hat in her hand, with tears freezing on her cheeks as she remembered the dark eyes of the figure that took Daniel away. She heard the bell before she saw it lying in the snow, half covered by ice, ringing softly as the wind moved around her. She picked it up and felt the cold sink into her bones as the bell stopped ringing and the world felt empty around her. Kevin opened his eyes inside the dark mall, with the cold around him and the mannequins standing frozen in place with their small painted smiles. He saw the bell lying on the floor, ringing softly as the lights above flickered. He picked it up, and the bell stopped ringing. The mannequins fell to the floor with soft thuds, and the lights went out, leaving him in the dark, but he felt the cold leave his skin for the first time in the silence. They all found themselves standing in the same snowy field under the gray sky, Emily holding her bell, Marcus and Noah holding theirs, Sarah with her bell in one hand and the red hat in the other, Kevin with the bell cold in his hand. They looked at each other with eyes wide and cold breaths mixing. In the air they did not know each other, but they knew the bells had brought them together. The wind moved around them, with a soft whisper like voices calling from the trees around them. The snow fell harder, and the bells in their hands began to ring together, slow and soft in the cold air. They looked down at the bells and felt the cold spread from the metal into their hands and up their arms as the world around them grew darker, the snow turning to black flakes falling from the sky, the trees bending with the weight of the dark snow. As the bells rang louder now in the cold air, they saw figures moving between the trees, pale and thin with dark eyes and wide smiles, wearing old red coats and hats. The figures moved closer with each ring of the bells, their black eyes watching. Without blinking, the bells rang louder, and the figures stepped into the clearing surrounding Emily, Marcus, Noah, Sarah, and Kevin. The cold air turned heavy, and the snow stopped falling. The bells stopped ringing, and the world went silent. The figures lifted their hands and pointed at the bells in their hands. Emily looked at Marcus and Sarah and Kevin and Noah with tears in her eyes as she dropped the bell in the snow. The others dropped theirs, and the bells lay in the snow silent. The figures bent down and picked up the bells, holding them close to their chests. The wind moved again, and the figures began to fade with the wind, turning into snow and ice and cold air. As the bells disappeared with them, the sky cleared, and the sun broke through the clouds, touching the field with soft light. The cold left the air, and the snow turned white again. The trees stood tall and silent with no shadows moving between them. Emily, Marcus, Noah, Sarah, and Kevin stood in the light, feeling the warmth on their skin for the first time in what felt like forever. The curse was lifted, and the bells were gone. The figures were gone, and the dark was gone. They looked at each other and smiled small, tired smiles, knowing they were free. The wind moved through the trees with a soft sound like a song, and the sun climbed higher in the sky as they walked away from the field, leaving the snow and the cold and the dark behind them forever. The end.